So welcome to a Canadian Patriot Review Podcast, where I'm happy to be joined by my good friend, Alex Krainer. And Alex is a commodities trader. He's a hedge fund manager. He's the author of some impressive works. There's a very, very popular book that he recently wrote called The Grand Deception, The Truth About, was it the Magnitsky Act, Browder, and the Anti-Russia Sanctions? Am I getting that title correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And Alex has recently composed a wonderful trilogy very recently, which I had the great honor of reposting on the Canadian Patriot Review website, dealing with something that I think is just so strategically important for today's age. The actual title was the Appeasement and Shocking Truth of the 1938 Munich Agreements, which is something that is, again, it's very important because we are entering an age today of great turbulence. Not only do we have a lot of parallels to the type of conditions internationally, geopolitically, economically that were shaping the world in 1938, 39, but you have literally a repetition around many quarters politically of political hacks. The Canadian foreign minister recently met with Anthony Blinken, for example, and said that, you know, we have to agree. We came out of our agreement agreeing, or our meeting agreeing that Putin must stop his invasion plans of Ukraine. We're firm together. And you just hear this all over Europe, similar sorts of rhetoric, making a lot of parallels to the idiocy of Neville Chamberlain, who thought he could appease Hitler and didn't realize that Hitler was actually Hitler, the evil supervillain who, you know, we could have stopped if we were just more harsh and were willing to even go to war before he invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland and the rest. So, Alex, what you've done in your trilogy just blows the lid off of the mythologies that we were all fed in school and that are justifying a lot of this repetition of the narrative today. So I'm glad that we're here to talk about it. And I was hoping maybe you could just say a little bit of something about what is it that provoked you to compose this trilogy in your own words before we jump into some details of what you were doing.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Matt, and warm greetings to all your listeners. Basically, you know, both this trilogy that I recently published and the book Grand Deception was motivated by the same thing, namely that I've been watching for the past 20 years, the West collectively piling in on Russia, non-stop demonizing Russian President Putin, and the NATO relentlessly moving to the east, piling up troops and the arsenal of heavy weaponry closer and closer to Russia's borders. And I just see this as very concerning signs of danger that at some point in the near future we might sleepwalk into World War III, which would at this point be unthinkable because you have Russia as a nuclear power, and on the other side you have three nuclear powers, two of which have pretty much said that they adopt a nuclear first strike policy, being the United States and the UK, and one of which has actually used nuclear bombs on the civilian population of their wartime adversaries. So I think that the situation is extremely dangerous, and I see the push for war coming definitely from the West, not from Russia. And there's no doubt about it because we even have empirical data on all the wars that have been conducted in the world since 1946. You know, there was a study published in 2014, I think, in the Journal of Public Health, where a group of American researchers tallied up all the wars, all the international military conflicts that happened between 1946, so after World War II, and 2001. And they found that the United States has initiated fully 80% of them. So, obviously the war dynamic is coming from the West. And in my book, I try to explain why. Okay, and it's something that has to do with the problem called the deflationary gap, but we don't want to get into that in this talk. So anyway, the war push coming from the West. I've also seen recently as the tensions between Russia and the West are escalating to a boiling point, that various politicians started to talk about appeasement. And the talk about appeasement is kind of devious, because what they're telling you is that, oh look, Neville Chamberlain made this terrible mistake. He thought he could appease Hitler to avoid the war, and what he got instead was a big war, because Hitler was going to try to conquer the world anyhow. And the implication being that, today Ukraine is Czechoslovakia, and the Donbass is the Sudetenland, and Vladimir Putin is Hitler. And so to avoid a big world war, we should go and destroy Hitler, right, being Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't spare any expense. We shouldn't be risk averse in any sense. We should just take whatever consequences come, and we should have that war in order to prevent that war. Mm-hmm. Which is, when they invoke appeasement, they're actually telling you, let's go to war. So that kind of horrified me. And then, so I wanted to throw light on what that episode of history actually was, rather than the sanitized, airbrushed story that they fed us in school, which is a complete distortion of what actually happened. And it shows the villains as the good guys. Not that Hitler was a good guy in any sense. He was a bad guy anyway. But the real villains were Neville Chamberlain and his foreign policy cabal. So that's what I wanted to expose. To try to, in whatever small way, push back against the rhetoric that is pushing us towards war against Russia.
Absolutely, and you did an amazing job on that. And I think the thing that really gave you the edge to zero in is you had a certain sense of a way of looking at history, which not many people have, which is why I really resonated to your technique, which is to look at, well, what didn't happen, though, was in many ways probabilistically going to happen had certain decisions not been made. And you make a point that people like Neville Chamberlain, who is often treated as a bit of a doofus, at best, him and his cabinet, and grand strategists in many ways, who arranged the appeasement, arranged the Munich discussions and all of these. They're treated kind of like as doofuses who were made understandable but wrong decisions ultimately by letting Hitler go and take and carve up Sudetenland and then take Poland and everything else. But really that was a mistaken thing, and we don't want to judge him too harshly. Now you were able to zero in on the fact that no, people like Lord Halifax, like Chamberlain, had a grand design that involved utilizing Hitler for a completely different reason than what we're told. And you bring up in your trilogy the 3-block world for the New World Order that would have been. And I was hoping you could maybe say a little bit something about what was this 3-block world that Neville Chamberlain and Halifax were trying to organize for, and what they wanted Hitler to be a part of.
So basically, the 3-block world is something that we have with us today still. It's this theme that refuses to go away. And I think, I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, but I know that as the British Empire was starting to collapse in the late 19th and early 20th century, the British elites were kind of scrambling to find a way to federalize the empire and to keep it intact. And, like then they created this Commonwealth of Nation, just to kind of try to put the lipstick on the pig to make it look, so it stays the same thing, but it looks different, kind of like still today they're trying, like now it's Cool Britannia, now it's Global Britain, they keep trying to figure out a new way to dress up this monster. And anyway, in those academic discussions, I think that they kind of put together the idea that they could kind of continue effectively to maintain the empire and rule the world by kind of dividing it into three blocks, where Britain, in alliance with the United States, would control the Euro-Atlantic zone, so the North America, South America, UK and Europe, in alliance with Japan to control the East Asia. And then, they have this obsession with controlling Eurasia, and there the idea is that ruling Central and Eastern Europe is the key to ruling the heartland, and ruling the heartland is the key to ruling the whole of Eurasian landmass. And so they wanted to use Germany as hegemon in Central and Eastern Europe, with which they would secure their hegemony over the Eurasian landmass, but also use Germany as an advanced technological power to make it a bludgeon with which to destroy Russia, because Russia is their number one rival in their ambition to secure hegemony over the Eurasian landmass. And this obsession with dominating Eurasian landmass is something that goes back to 100 years, but it was explicitly formulated as such by Sir Halford Mackinder in 1904 in his Heartland theory. But then exactly the same thing is repeated by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his Grand Chessboard. Brzezinski, who happens to be also a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission in the United States, yeah, which also is a think tank for high-level cooperation between Japan, the powers of Western Europe, and the United States. So again, these three blocks, right? Mm-hmm. And anyway, so this kind of ideology, which objective of this ideology is nothing other than to continue ruling the world as an empire, is what prompted the ruling elite and Neville Chamberlain in particular to try to set up Hitler and Germany as that hegemon in Central and Eastern Europe. So it seems that it wasn't random that they chose Hitler, because I think that they purposely wanted to have a slightly fanatical, nationalistic person in charge of Germany. Somebody who would be willing to be militant and aggressive towards his geopolitical adversaries, right? Kind of like, I think the same reason why they like Alexei Navalny in Russia, even though Navalny couldn't fill like 4 busloads with his supporters, his lost.
No, that's a great parallel. That Hitler was kind of like, I never heard that before, like an Alexei Navalny that succeeded. that's funny. That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, but if they manage to ever put Navalny into the Kremlin, I guarantee you that they would get the war out of Russia.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they would be able to get a world war with Russia on the bandwagon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that would probably happen. Anyway, the explanations that I was able to find of why they chose Hitler is because after World War I, there was the Versailles Treaty. Germany had massive obligations towards France, so that, you know, a very large chunk of Germany's future GDP growth, profits, production, and so forth was already, you know, kind of
Destroyed. I mean, stolen.
Well, no. I don't mean stolen, but it would automatically have to be paid to France in war reparations.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right. And so the Western bankers, meaning Wall Street and London bankers, wanted somebody who would cheat France out of those reparations, who would say, like, guess what? We're not going to pay you anything, and risk the confrontation between Germany and France. At that time, France was by far the most powerful military in Europe.
Mm.
Okay, so it wasn't like it wouldn't have been a small thing to confront France. So apparently, for that reason, they wanted to choose like a fanatical nationalistic type. And then they deliberately worked to fund Hitler and the Nazi Party. He obtained money from Northwestern bankers, from the American bankers who, you know, they funded the party. They funded the electoral campaigns and so forth. They gave him advice. Once the Nazis were in power, they got lots and lots of credits for essentially rearmament. And so from very early on, the Western financial interests were backing Hitler, knowing fully well what they were doing. And you know, the myth that Hitler just kind of spontaneously happened because Germany was in a crisis and people were demoralized, and there was inflation and deflation and depression and all this, and then the nationalistic leader just popped up and everybody rallied around him. It took a lot for them to put Hitler in power. Mm-hmm. President Hindenburg, who had, you know, who wasn't just a figurehead, who actually had certain powers in Germany, was consistently refusing to nominate Hitler as a chancellor, because he knew exactly the kind of danger that Hitler represented for Germany and for Europe. And so he was refusing. The Nazi Party, at best in elections, their top score with all the electoral engineering, with all the supports from the media, from the bankers, from the top they ever got in elections was I think like 37.5%. Maybe it was 37.6, but it was right about there. It was never even close to half the electorate ever voting for the Nazis. Mm-hmm. So this was a kind of, you know, slow motion color revolution. You know, like it wasn't exactly a color revolution, but it was one of those sustained efforts to infiltrate German politics with a nationalistic party and a fanatical nationalistic leader, because the centers of financial power had an agenda, and that agenda was to create a hegemon in the continental Europe, and it was going to be Germany. I don't know why Germany, but I suppose it's because it's the, you know, like it's the largest economic power, and you know, it's shown itself to be you know, well organized society capable of generating powerful technologies and quality production and so forth, a well-organized society, disciplined people, large population and so on. So basically, a political entity they could take on Russia, and they could rule the roost in Central and Eastern Europe. So from historical records that are now beyond dispute, it's not a question of conspiracy. It is very clear that the British foreign policy establishment was actually guiding Hitler on towards the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, and then the annexation of Czechoslovakia, and the 1938 Munich Agreement, which is what the appeasement refers to. And then the idea was to take over Danzig in Poland, today's Gdansk,
yeah,
and a corridor connecting it with Germany proper.
mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was the idea. Obviously, Hitler accepted the role. He played along, but he had his own ideas. Okay, and so after the Munich conference, he was basically done. He said, I hope that no dirty pig ever suggests another international conference ever again. He said, this was my first international conference and definitely the last one. And when he said no dirty pig, he was referring to Neville Chamberlain. And so, when it came time for him to take over Gdansk and the corridor connecting Gdansk with Germany, well, he had the idea of just taking over the whole of Poland anyway, so that's what he did. And this is where I think that the Western establishment realized that they didn't really have control over Hitler.
But at this point in the story, though, and I want to talk a little bit more after about the Czechoslovakia element a year before the takeover of Poland. But at this point, you're saying that this is where the faction around Chamberlain in Britain realized that they had something that they weren't able to wield the way they thought they could. But you also make the point that Britain, which controlled, just like today, the international center of finance, it had a huge amount of influence, and it was also the mediator diplomatically behind all sorts of conflicts, putting themselves in the position of an Iago, being able to just set everybody up to take falls. They promised Poland support for Poland's opposition to Germany's requests or demands for these various territories for some time, and you make a point that they withheld the promised loans to the point that finally, maybe when it was far too late, they allowed maybe $8-9 million to go to Poland, but they were still giving almost $1 billion to Germany. That was in regards to Poland, right? Or was that in? That was
yeah. That was with regards to Poland. That's right.
Yeah.
So basically, Britain issued a unilateral guarantee to Poland, and there was talk about, at the time, there was talk about Britain providing Poland some £100 million in loans to rearm, providing military assistance and so forth. But in effect, all it was basically one paragraph, a very strangely worded paragraph, which, the British foreign policy establishment was kind of treading a fine line between running this secret agenda and selling the facts on the ground to their public, because the British public was viscerally opposed to Nazism, to this expansionist policy of the Nazis and Hitler, and the Neville Chamberlain and his foreign policy cabal, they were kind of supporting Hitler and pushing him forward, but at the same time trying to pretend before their own public that they're opposed to him and that they just like don't really know how to restrain him. And so they issued this guarantee to Poland as though they were ready to, go to war if, yeah, exactly, except that they did nothing at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, even though it became very clear that Hitler had every intention of attacking Poland, the British did exactly nothing. They kind of slow walked all their commitments, and out of the 100 million pounds that they led the Poles believe that they will loan them, in the end it turned out to be a loan of just something barely over $8 million. And that loan was approved, I think, about a month before Hitler actually invaded. And so it was way too late to do anything with that. And then the armaments that the Polish were able to acquire with this were a complete waste of money. It was they were not able to even use it. So what happened is that Hitler just ran over Poland like knife through butter.
Yeah. And
so like the whole, as Carol Quigley said, that the British position was key to everything, because at the time, like they really did rule the waves. They really did control all the trade routes. London was the center of power. It was easy for them to harass countries, to sanction them, to make trade difficult for them, to make it difficult for them to acquire resources they needed for rearmament, for food, everything. The London really had power over European nations, over most nations, and as a consequence, everybody conducted their foreign policies in consultation with London. Mm-hmm. And London played this double game where like they had one agenda, but it was the politics were always like, why don't you and him fight? Let's you and him fight, So always pitting one side against the other, always creating these crisis flashpoints where they could pretend like they're helping one side while they're actually also helping the other side. Everybody's slowly sinking into debt to London, depending on London for armaments, for international diplomatic support, praying for their recognition and approval. And so, the Czechs, which, another myth that, people think that when Hitler started off, that the German Wehrmacht was this overwhelming, irresistible power. Yeah. They could just like run over countries like nothing. It wasn't like that, like the Czech military was much superior to the German military in 1938.
Yeah, that surprised me when you brought that up. I had no idea. I had also thought that they were inferior on so many levels militarily, and I thought that the Nazis were this giant military machine that was, no questions asked, like superior. But no, you actually point out that on every level, technological, except for maybe air defense, but technologically on every other level, the Czechoslovakia was so much more powerful than we realized and could have done effective battle in defense, in self-defense.
Yeah, exactly. So
what's going on there?
Yeah. So, if Czechoslovakia had decided, like Russia today, to say, okay, we draw a red line, you cross the red line, we're going to war. Instead of that, they were trying to avoid war. They were consulting with London. London was telling them, give Germans some concessions because they are, so for months ahead of the Munich conference, of the appeasement, the British were consistently driving the Czech side to disarm, to not mobilize its troops in order to not provoke Hitler, to give more and more and more concessions, to the point where the the country became paralyzed. It became impossible to give the army the order, okay, let's go to war, now we fight. You know, it completely cut the legs from under the nation. And what it turned out, in fact, is that they had a phenomenally well equipped, well organized, very high morale army that could have stopped German army dead in its track. And at the highest level, the German military themselves knew that this was a fact. Mm. And so, not knowing about the coordination between Hitler and the British, the Neville Chamberlain government, they thought that Hitler's intent to take over Sudetenland by force was suicidal. So they actually had a plan to assassinate Hitler if he didn't back.
Right.
This was a very serious plan, you know, like, and this plan was communicated to the British because even the German general staff thought that London was the fair arbiter in the whole thing, and that they would do the right thing to prevent the war from breaking out. Whereas, you know, London went around behind their backs and did everything to shield Hitler from his generals' mutiny. His generals tried to do everything.
I know you brought this up quickly with General Beck of Germany and others who naively believed that they could trust Britain. But there were several attempts on Hitler's life in the course of World War II. And I know you didn't really explicitly talk about that, but since it's being brought up in the course of your research, do you think that the British sabotaged those attempts on Hitler's life to give Hitler either forward intelligence that this was going to happen or anything like that? Or is that not something you've really looked into?
I honestly, I have no idea. I have no idea.
Okay.
I know that this was, I think, the first attempt at Hitler's life by his generals, and that one was definitely sabotaged by the British.
Okay.
There's no doubt about that.
Okay. Yeah, and the point you bring up too, that the the British propaganda, the Daily Mail, were putting psyops onto the German people who were very much, as you said, anti-Nazi. The British people were anti-Nazi. The majority of the members of their parliament were anti-Nazi. They didn't, and so it showed. It really went far to show what the nature of the empire is. People have this naive idea of the British Empire being the government, the British elitist people, and it wasn't that at all. The people were very much they despised fascism, and but you had a big propaganda operation constantly, kind of like what we suffer from today when you open up whether left or right wing press agencies talking about what's going on either in Hong Kong or in Ukraine, and you're given these terrible horror stories of invasion, suppression by the great bad authoritarian state that you should fear. And the same thing was done, right? Where the British people were being fed these lies that the Czechoslovakian government was suppressing the poor people of Sudetenland and the Slovaks and the Poles and the Hungarians. And ultimately, you know, there was like a cutting off of people's ability to understand what was really going on. But why did the Czechoslovakian government go along with this and even allow for such things as the demand for, like, you know, at a certain point, there was a demand made for allowing self-determination of these different ethnic groups within Czechoslovakia, and the government was somehow, despite their ability to resist, they still went along with it, and that didn't work out because they were still invaded. Well, why?
Well, I think that we can recognize some of those dynamics even today, you know, because if you, well, this is always being done, you know, like if you wanted to put pressure on Croatian government today, for example, then you can start insinuating that they are violating the human rights of the minority Serb population, and I'm sure you can find ways to say that. And then you could tell them, oh, you know, we're gonna, you know, put you under sanctions of some sort. And then the government say like, okay, we're gonna let them gonna let them, whatever, use Cyrillics on their street names, or like it starts from there. And then once you start giving concessions, it goes like, well, no, like now we want, like they then start. It was very clear in the Czech situation that as the Czech government, like the Czech government really had the best treatment of its minority populations, because it was full of minorities, and Germans actually in certain part of Czechoslovakia were the majority population. So they really did try to institute some kind of a system of fairness that, like all these minorities would have, high standard of rights and blah, blah, blah. And so it was all okay in a way. And it worked, because the Czech Republic was far and away the most prosperous and well-organized country that came out of the Habsburg Empire. And it was really an economic powerhouse at the time. And I remember that, like back in the days, in the beginning of the 20th century, when my grandparents were like young people, where young people aspired to go to university was the Czech Republic, the Czechoslovakia, right, to Prague. Like so Prague was like today, young people want to go to study in the United States still. Back then in Europe, it was people aspired to go to study in Czechoslovakia. So it was like a very advanced, well-developed, economically prosperous society. But, you can always start creating problems and kick off a destabilization agenda by using minorities. Well, this is how war in Yugoslavia started, like in Croatia, they started creating all these problems between Croatians and the Serb minorities.
Yeah, right.
And so forth. And so today you see this, like they start putting pressure on Chinese governments about the Uyghur population, because how the West loses a lot of sleep over the human rights of Muslims. And so, if the target country is in a weak position and maybe doesn't think that it can tolerate sanctions and I don't know, diplomatic boycott, economic boycott, whatever, then they think like, okay, well, let's give some concessions to these Sudeten Germans and maybe they'll be nice to us. Yeah. And then they say like, well, okay, but that's not enough, you need to give us more concessions. And I go like, okay, we'll give them more concessions. And it's like, what, that's it? We need more concessions. And so this went, and it was clearly the British, the Neville Chamberlain government that was on the one side driving Hitler to demand more and more concessions, and on the other side pressuring the Czechs to give more and more concessions.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So over a space of several months, at least since March to 1938, Britain was actively involved in these negotiations, and it brought to Czechoslovakia's complete paralysis, where it was unable to defend itself when Hitler's troops crossed the borders and went into Sudetenland. And then when they took over the Sudetenland, the rump Czechoslovakia was again defenseless. And so in the next cycle, they took the whole country apart.
Mm-hmm.
So the result is that one of the most powerful militaries in Europe at the time completely did not defend itself against Nazism.
And then the Nazis had a nice armory to just equip themselves with tanks that were far more advanced, as you pointed out, than even the German tanks were, as well as machine guns and a million rifles. And I mean, my God, which was very useful for them for everything that came afterwards. So
because Czech military equipment was much superior to German military equipment. Yeah. Not only, but they also thereby acquired the production facilities that produced those that arsenal. So
right.
yeah, that the takeover of Czechoslovakia kind of cemented Germany's hegemony over continental Europe. And this brings us back to what the agenda was, and the agenda was exactly to make Germany the hegemon over Central and Eastern Europe. So what was achieved through appeasement was not a mistake. It was exactly what the British foreign policy establishment intended.
Yeah, right.
So
That's vitally important. Vitally important. The question then becomes, and I know you've alluded to this, but that blew up in their face. The British financier oligarchy was moving in that direction, and at a certain moment after the takeover of Poland, as you pointed out, things started falling out. The machine stopped working the way they wanted it to. And what exactly, could you say a little bit something about, okay, well, Neville Chamberlain was eventually taken out of position. They changed strategy and had to, I guess, put down their Frankenstein monster that they created that was going on a rampage. What went into Hitler's head? What did Hitler want when he started disobeying the original blueprint and going renegade in a sense? And what was going on there with the shifting of strategies in the British establishment?
Well, I think that, after Hitler attacked Poland, Chamberlain could no longer sell his double game to the British public, so he was politically done. He could no longer justify the so-called appeasement. It became unjustifiable. I don't think that the British particularly cared about Poland one way or the other, but I think that they didn't want Hitler to dissipate German military on going to war against Poland, because they wanted him to go against Russia.
Right.
I think the whole intent with the Nazi project was to go and kill Russia, which is what World War II essentially was, because even Hitler himself would say that everything that he sent to Belgium and France and so forth to the west of Europe were basically firefighting units. He sent like a force of 3 million soldiers and 3,000 tanks, and it was like Operation Barbarossa was the biggest invasion ever put together in the history of mankind. And the only purpose of that was to destroy Russia once and for all, so that the British Empire could forever secure the hegemony over the Eurasian landmass.
The Heartland, yeah. Which brings up the point of Mackinder as well, because in one of Mackinder's earlier writings, he had made a point, I forget which piece it was, but he had made a point that one of the greatest threats to the British Empire is this is pre-World War I, but a coalition of Russia and Germany working together. And if that were to happen, that would be the greatest threat to the empire, because what was Germany and Russia before World War I? They were applying the systems of protective tariffs, of long-term credit emissions for rail development, and doing it with their neighbors for industrial growth. And so that was something that the British saw as just unacceptable. It was a big fear.
That was unacceptable. Yeah, that is unacceptable, because the British model is pure naked imperial plunder.
Yeah.
So every nation is regarded exclusively as a resource, both in terms of natural resources and human labor. Like human labor, the human populations there are nothing other than human resource to extract the natural resources for British banks to fund, British, American, Western, whatever, and for their own corporations to exploit. That's it. You can't really point to very many nations in the world that have applied this system that now enjoy any kind of sustained prosperity. Like after 2 years in Africa, they've created misery and poverty.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And same thing for India, same thing for South America, essentially everywhere they went.
It's mind-boggling, right? Because it's like everywhere that this British system is applied in every nation that trusts this type of thing, including globalization today, which is just a rewiring of the same old formula, you have destruction, death, famine, war, division everywhere. And yet there's something in their ability to wrap sweetness around poison that allows so many subsequent generations to somehow forget the lessons that they should have learned from the past and just go right back to drinking from this sweet poison Kool-Aid again and again and again and again and again with the same sort of effects. Is that not amazing?
That is amazing, but I think that it's not so difficult to explain, because this system extracts a tremendous amount of wealth from all of their imperial conquests. And then they use a lot of that, they use some of that wealth to then feed the narrative, like they acquire the media in the target nations. They start paying the academia, they start funding the academia, you have George Soros universities popping up left and right. They fund the academic journals. So the narrative becomes entrenched to the point where if you question that narrative, it's almost like, what is the matter with you? Are you nuts? Everybody knows that this is the way it is, like that this is the best system we've ever had. The best system we've ever had. Look at the development we've had over the last 200-300 years since this industrial revolution and so forth. Of course, nobody sees that this comes at a huge cost to the nations that are victims to this. I mean, what did they calculate? That the British Empire extracted something like $20 trillion equivalent from India. And do I remember that correctly?
I heard something
like that. There
was
was something right about in that
Tharoor,
ballpark.
Yeah, I remember Tharoor made that statistic public, and that's shocking.
Yeah, and so you might stop and wonder, like, what would India look like today if it were left alone? Yeah. What would that society be like today?
Well, China and India in the 18th century, they were by far, they had the leading GDP.
They were the global economic superpowers. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So they got decimated. They got absolutely destroyed because this system, and I don't even like to call it British so much, because it's not like the British people have anything much to do with it. Mm-hmm. This system just kind of like set itself there as a parasite, and is deceiving both the British people and everything else around itself.
Yeah.
It's just that this system of governance, this imperial system, is extracting wealth from everywhere else in the world towards itself and creating misery everywhere it goes.
Yeah. So let me jump ahead to our present age a little bit, because here we are now, 80 years into the wake. I mean, the Hitler Project was put down. The eugenics and all of the associated programs that came with that were also put down. But here we are, and we are replicating so many of the errors of thinking, so many of the same parallel political structures with similar agendas are now in operation today above nation states once more. There's a push for even utilizing a war with a military encirclement of Russia and China. There's psyops on many levels targeting the Western psyche. What do you think the conditions are right now in terms of breaking this project once more? I know back then we had Stalin, we had Franklin Roosevelt, and we had many other anti-fascists who were able to stay on top of the situation and change the dynamic sufficiently to give humanity a second chance. Here we are. What do you see as being the battleground going forward, and what are our best pathways to survival in your eyes, in your opinion?
Well,
that's a big one.
I think I think we're at an extremely interesting point in history, and I don't know, I think it was about at some point in 2020,
Hmm.
I wrote this article that the banking cartel is driving the COVID-19 agenda. It was a little bit over a year ago. And I said that I was convinced that the agenda was not going to succeed. It was far too ambitious. It was just not going to succeed. And I said that they have probably foreseen that there would be a pushback, that there would be massive pushback from the people, and that they would try to distract us, and that the most reliable way to completely distract the populations would be war, so that they would do their utmost to orchestrate a major war. And little more than a year later, we are at the stage where it feels like we're on the precipice of World War III. And I don't think we are certain to avoid it, but let's say that I am significantly more optimistic about the outcome of today's crisis than I think was possible, in the build-up to World War II and the build-up to World War I. And there are a few reasons for that. First of all, we have the most obvious thing is we have the internet. So we no longer depend on information being disseminated from centers, people depended on newspapers, radio, and televisions.
Yeah, the Ministry of Truth.
And so that was the Ministry of Truth. It was much easier for the Ministry of Truth to control the narrative. Mm-hmm. Today, it's much more difficult because people clearly are exposed to a much more diverse universe of information than was ever possible in the past. And I know that people, people tend to be frustrated because, the moment you become exposed to some interesting piece of information, you immediately tend to think like, oh God, how come everybody doesn't get this? But, this is always a process. It takes time for people to kind of smell the source of lies and to kind of shift away from it and to feel out more credible sources and to kind of gravitate towards sources of truth. But over time, it's unmistakable and you can see it. And the best example for this is the success of Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, some years ago, nobody even knew who that was. He was just like MMA fighter, right? And then commentator of MMA fights. Mixed martial arts, right?
I knew of him only because of he was a sub character on a sitcom that I used to like. But yeah, that was it.
Okay. I had no idea. I started following Joe Rogan because he had these really interesting podcasts with Graham Hancock and all those Egyptologist guys and geology. So I thought like, hey, this is interesting. But that's that. But you see that once upon a time, the most trusted name in news was CNN. Today, they cannot crack 1 million viewers, even on their most popular show.
Right.
Whereas Joe Rogan attracts an average of 11 million viewers on his podcast. And his podcast with Robert Malone, I think, had 60 million viewers. So, that tells you that as a collective, we are gravitating towards quality sources of information and away from peddlers of lies. And so it's becoming extremely difficult for those in power to kind of keep their narrative intact. Mm-hmm. And so obviously, at this point, they are dying to go to war against Russia. They're dying for us to go to war against Russia, because that would be a godsend for them. All this nonsense with COVID, all these measures, blah blah blah. You could force it hard on everybody if you could impose a war agenda on top of it, because you could instantly elect all political opposition. Well, like I've lived through the outbreak of war in the Balkans. I've watched it happen. And once a war gets going, the psychological effect is amazing. Like even if you hate your leadership, the moment war kicks off, there's no more discussion. There's no, like you don't like Justin Trudeau.
Rally around leader, yeah.
You rally around Justin Trudeau because he's the leader now. If you question that, you're unpatriotic. Are you a Russian traitor? Are you pro-Russian?
Mm-hmm.
Like you could disappear real quick. Mm-hmm. People like Joe Rogan and Jimmy Dore and Tucker Carlson, people like that will be taken off air straight away. There will be very little discussion about that.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, war against Russia would be godsend to the elites. Mm-hmm. But it's very obvious that there's no enthusiasm anywhere for war with Russia, and that even selling Russia as a big villain and as the last blemish on the face of humanity is not holding up at all.
What is it when the oligarchy looks at Russia right now? Because Russia is not falling for the bait. They've been trying so hard to set up traps and bait. They've tried as well with Hong Kong, Taiwan, and all sorts of things to set up bait and traps with China. We know that both of them have certain strategic relationships that are very important. But what are they afraid of when they look at Russia or their allies right now? In your words,
sorry.
What is the oligarchy afraid of so much when they see Russia or China? Because many people would say, "Oh, but everybody's controlled. They're all in on the same geopolitical great game." It's the apparent opposition is just a fraud. I get that a lot, and people writing to me. So in that sense, the oligarchy is certainly afraid of something in Russia that Russia is representing, such that they want the war that they don't feel that they control. So, in your words, or do you have any thoughts of what is it that they're so afraid of there in that part of Eurasia?
Well, one thing I've noticed that throughout history, the empire itself is very, very cautious about going to war. That they're often go to great lengths to try to achieve their objectives without actually going to war. The appeasement episode itself is an example, because they totally wanted Hitler to take over Czechoslovakia, but they were like, no shots fired. We're going to get this done without a war. Without a war. I think that I thought about why. I mean, what do you care? You're investing so much money into military. You're building up this massive military machines. Why are you so hesitant to go to war? And it seems to me that there's always a risk that the outcome is not predictable. I think that if the push for war results in a defeat, that they risk upsetting the apple cart, like the hierarchy that they kind of very carefully staff with tried and tested and recruited and trained up lapdogs that they put in charge to lead. And then if there's a defeat, there might be a populist movement to push back. I think that's a possibility. But there's another more important factor to take into account, and I think that during most of the 20th centuries, at the very least since the Bolshevik coup in Russia in 1917, there has been a close coordination between the Soviet Union and the West. Not at the level of US president versus, the Secretary General of the Communist Party, but at the higher level, at the level of their central bank, okay, because they were partners in this project. The Soviet Union was not the project of the Soviet laborers. It was the project of the Western banking elites.
And Jacob Schiff and Warburg and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so they cooperated at very highest levels, and there's some, like there's some shocking examples of this. But for example, I don't know if you had the chance to read the Guido Giacomo Preparata's Conjuring Hitler.
No.
It's an absolute masterpiece about about how Hitler was put in power and kicked off the World War II. It's a not a single word is out of place. I'm not often jealous of books, but this one I'm jealous of. Anyway, he makes a fairly compelling case that there was a high-level coordination between the Soviet government and the British foreign policy establishment. At key junctures, making sure that there was going to be a war between Germany and the
Would he be raising the issue of the Trotskyite fifth column inside of Russia that was trying to periodically take back control after Trotsky was expelled, or was he talking about something else?
No, he was talking about Soviet Union selling out the socialist and communist parties of Germany.
Okay.
They sold them out to Hitler, and they basically all got slaughtered, even though they were an important movement in Germany at the time.
Okay.
And it was basically the Soviets who sold them out to Hitler. And but then there's also the fact that Soviet Union, if it was truly a rival empire, why would they create the euro-dollar market? Why would they empower the dollar as a reserve currency for the whole world? Wouldn't they demand payment for their own oil in rubles? Wouldn't they enforce their own currency as a reserve currency in their sphere of influence? Then then there's Anthony Sutton, who documents the military technology exchange. That when when the Americans developed a game-changing military technology where they would have now undisputed military superiority over Soviet Union, then somehow this technology, with all the blueprints and all the machinery for producing it, would somehow quickly make its way into Soviet Union. And the Soviet.
Yeah, I've only recently begun looking into this as well. But this is during the period of the Cold War, is what you're saying here, right?
When I think it was Cold War, but it goes all the way back to from the time the Bolsheviks took power in 1917.
Yeah.
Up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a close coordination between the top echelon of Western power and the top echelon of Soviet power.
I think on this, you might find it really interesting to look at Grover Furr's work, his research on the Trotskyite conspiracies and all of the fifth column. So he sort of goes into Trotsky because he was the guy, mediating the money from Lord Milner, from Schiff and Warburg in Wall Street. And he was really the guy who was playing that all of the oligarchy really wanted to be in the dominant driving position the whole time. And there's been this mythology that Hitler, that Stalin made up the Trotsky conspiracy in order to justify purges of his enemies. But Grover Furr actually goes through all of this incredible declassified intel that demonstrates that there actually was this hardcore fifth column trying to kill Stalin in the 30s. And we're also negotiating with the Japanese fascists, with the British fascists, that Trotsky's people were working with the Nazis and giving promises to Ukrainian Nazis to have their own nationalism and independence as a participatory power within this new world order. Which was put down at a certain point. That I think would add a lot to this analysis.
I suspect so, yeah. But okay, so I would love to read this book, but the problem is that even after Trotsky was eliminated, this coordination and this cooperation continued.
Yeah, well, this is the thing with Khrushchev
so
too, because they say Khrushchev was probably also a Trotskyite.
Yeah, exactly. Like the inexplicable administrative joining of Crimea with Ukraine.
Yeah.
Like there are some really important decisions in the life of Soviet Union that were done basically to favor the weakening of Russia.
Yeah.
And the empowerment of the Western Empire.
Yeah.
And this exchange of weapons technology to always keep a pair between, to keep the power parity. And even when the West now had overwhelming military superiority, somehow this technology made its way quickly over to Soviet Union so that they could, and this kept happening. Today, this doesn't exist anymore. The Vladimir Putin's government is not in this category. This coordination between West and the Soviet Union is over. So now, when the Russians developed their Zircons and their S-400s and S-500s and their fifth generation aircraft, that's theirs.
Yeah.
They're not sending blueprints back to Washington to have them copied.
Mm-hmm.
And so the balance of power is changing, and it's changing irreversibly, because the problem in the West is that we have this toxic system that is, it bilks the American taxpayers. Well, I'm American, Europeans also, but primarily American taxpayers, it bilks them for hundreds of billions of dollars, basically $1 trillion per year. 760 is the military budget, but then, some of the military items are booked under the Department of Energy, and when you add it up all together, it comes pretty much to around $1 trillion a year.
Mm.
It isn't effective because it's kind of become a big, it's, the whole point of it is to build profits. It's a, it's a system beholden to bankers and military industrial corporations. The whole point of spending all this money is to generate profits for the shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
And the production of actually effective military weapons is a secondary consideration. And you see that on more and more weapon systems, that they're actually very, very expensive flops, like the F-35 jet, which was
an exercise in burning billions of dollars and doing nothing.
Yeah, and so this keeps happening, and the reason is not because they don't have the talent and the capability to produce effective weaponry. It's because the system favors the system favors projects that will drain the most money in ways that are untransparent and secret, and that cannot be traced and justified. For the most powerful people in the American society to make the most profits possible without having to be accountable. And so that often eliminates really capable people from the equation, because really capable people end up not wanting to participate in this kind of charade. And so the system ends up very flawed at its core. And so you have more and more often production of flawed system. It was when was it? In 2018 or 2019 that there was a briefing at the White House. They were gonna mobilize 150,000 troops to go and confront Iran. basically nothing came of it. Like I think that the 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 whole military establishment lost its potency.
Yeah.
In like, so anyway, like the question you asked me is how I feel about today's moment, and I think that for a variety of reasons I feel a lot more optimistic that we are going to arrest this march to war than was possible before World War II and World War I. And one of them is that this source of war, because remember when we started we talked about 80% of all wars since 1946 have been started by the United States. It is the system is losing its potency, and obviously the people within the system are losing appetite for war.
Yeah, and that just, I'd love to just end it right here on this point that we were talking about before our interview began, which is that one of the things that gives both of us great solace in many ways is just looking at the best and the brightest talent that the oligarchy has been able to muster and put into positions of managerial influence in political circles of Europe and North America. And if that's the best they got is a Kamala Harris or a Biden machine, whatever that is, or a Justin whatever in Canada, or this defense minister of Germany, my God, if that's the best that they can muster, then they have lost a lot of competence that maybe previous generations of more rigorously thinking oligarchs once had. And that's part of the problem, I think, of oligarchy, is that in time, they don't only just set out this net, they don't cast the net of stupidity for their victims, but they cause their own progeny to walk into and be processed by these nets of stupidification, so that the competency isn't there to even manage the type of grand schemes that they so devoutly desire. And that should give people a certain amount of heart. It's concerning, but it should give people a certain amount of heart as well at the same time.
I think, you're absolutely right. When you look at people like Justin Trudeau, when you look at the fact that the head of the European Central Bank is a convicted criminal, that the president of the ECB is the queen of corruption, like a person with the charisma of a damp rag, that practically everybody that have in the positions of power in the Western world are really, really mediocre people. But I mean, like, seriously dull, mediocre people. And that's a really big problem, because, like, for them to execute on the ambitious agendas, and my God, like, you wanna maintain a global empire, you need to mobilize the creative powers and the labor and devotion of a whole hierarchy of people below yourself. And like, if tomorrow Justin Trudeau gives the order to Canadian military, let's go to war to Russia. If Kamala Harris gives the order to the American troops, that's like pushing on a wet noodle. That's not going to electrify the nation to go and fight a war against evil Russians, because like, do you want to die for Kamala Harris? Do you want to die for Justin Trudeau?
Yeah.
It's not all the same, really. And so, yeah, in that sense, I totally agree with you, and it's an important point. And like, the reason for that is because high quality people like the just fired German Navy admiral, that caliber of people do not suffer bullshit and lies.
Yeah.
And this whole empire is built on bullshit and lies.
Yeah.
And so all they can do is to recruit and attract these World Economic Forum young leaders.
Yeah.
And as a result, you get people like Kamala Harris, you get people like Justin Trudeau, you get people like Boris Johnson. And I don't see how many people are going to trust them with their lives to go and fight the war for empire.
No, that's a far stretch of the imagination. Alex, thank you immensely. If people want to look more into your work and read your writing, well, obviously, if anybody listening to this who wants to read, and they should read that 3-part trilogy, just check the description box of this video, and they'll all be there. If they want to go to your website and look at more work or buy your book, what do they do?
Okay. So I have 3 books. All of them have been deleted by Amazon. My book about Bill Browder, The Grand Deception, which has the geopolitical aspects and about the nature of conflict between Russia and the West, that's available at the Red Pill Press, the only publishing house that was brave enough to publish that book. My other 2 books are not controversial. They're about trading and portfolio management and trend following. And they are now, thanks to Amazon, they are available for free on my website, iSystem Trend Following. And so for people who trade or who manage their own portfolios, they might like to visit my website, iSystem Trend Following. And if they hit the About button on the menu, they can find those 2 books, which are available for free. So,
Hey. Wonderful. So this is what you have to do. All right.
Excellent.
Yeah. Has their marching orders. Yeah.
And I'm on Twitter as Naked Hedgie. That's that.
Right, and that's the website too, nakedhedgie.com, right? Is the other website you publish on, or?
That's my that's my personal blog. That's the about everything and sundry. Whereas iSystem Trend Following is about the day job.
Great. Well, thank you immensely for taking the time to elucidate us.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure, Matt.
All right. Take care, Alex.
Excellent. Take care. Bye.
Bye.